Do you feel lost, like you've wandered into a dense, shadowed wood, unsure of the path forward? Do distractions pull you from the still, small voice, leaving your soul restless and searching? Have you felt the weight of silence and wondered if God has left you alone? Here on the Distracted Christian Podcast, we walk that dark night together. Every step draws us closer to the one who's been waiting. His love is the light that guides, His grace, the compass that never fails. The road to Ardenvale cut through the villages hollowed by dust and grief. Roofs sagged over empty doorways, faces stared from shadows, dull-eyed, as if hope had been worn thin by the Ash King's promises. In one hamlet, the murmurs began before he even reached the square. A widow and her sick child, driven from their home for refusing to bow to the Ash King's image. Uh, they lay there beneath the overhang of an abandoned stall, the girl restless on the straw mat. Villagers kept their distance, they glancing over with something between pity and fear. The wanderer stopped, and his eyes lingered on the child, narrowing in quiet concern. He crouched, the joints of his knees aching after the long day's march, and the girl's skin burned beat against his palm. Her breathing was shallow. He found a clay bowl and filled it from the village well. He tore a strip of the hem from his own cloak, and he dampened the cloth and laid it across her forehead, smoothing back the sweat-matted hair with a steady hand. With the other, he lifted her gently enough to help her sip water. The widow watched without a word. Her lips were pressed tight. Through the night he stayed, feeding the small fire beside them, shifting the cloth when it was warmed, and humming underneath his breath in a low, tuneless but constant melody. In the firelight, his mind flickered back over his life and the hollowness that now lived inside him. But here, tending the child, he felt something filling it, a steady, fierce pull to give what he could. It was not the rapture he had once knew, but something sharper. Love that longed without expecting to be answered. A wound that had not closed, and perhaps it never would. By first light, the fever broke. Her eyelids fluttered open, confused but clear. The wanderer's face softened into a smile, tired and warm enough to reach his eyes. The widow covered her mouth and was sobbing all at once. Around them, the villagers slowed their steps. None really spoke, but something in the air eased. And he rose, he dusted his knees, and he left them with the last of his water. By the next village, the word had already traveled. People who had been ignored now stepped forward, shy but willing to speak. He never named himself. He didn't give a sigil. He didn't claim a title. He only listened to people, nodding, and he gazed into the eyes of whoever was speaking. One night, he was camped among the ruins, and a handful of refugees shared his fire. There, the stories came out as fragments, homes burned, children missing, faith lost when the heavens stayed silent. A man across the flames spoke of his son's death and the emptiness left behind. His voice cracked on the last word, and the wanderer leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and then he reached across and clasped the man's hands. "You are not abandoned," he said, the voice low but certain. And for an instant, the flame between them flared, smokeless and blue. The refugees gasped, and the man gripped the wanderer's hand tighter. The glow quickly faded, though, as it came. The wanderer hadn't seen it. He felt only the ache in his soul deepen. It was like a whisper brushing against the edge of his hearing, too brief to hold, but enough to remind him of what he loved and yet could not reach. The touch did not satisfy, it only sharpened the hunger for the flame. And he shook his head, his lips curving in a half smile. Not in me, but in all of us who have divine love, he said. They listened as he urged them to watch over one another, to expect no sign but the quiet work of care in the name of the flame. And as the days passed, a few stayed with him, not as followers of a prophet per se, but as fellow travelers. He carried the packs of the old and lifted children to his shoulders, and when their footsteps faltered, laughter came easy to him now, a low and kind of a surprising sound. The path from the Ash King's dungeon to this moment unrolled in his mind, the chains, the burn, the hallowing, and now this unhurried heat in his chest. It was not fullness, but a longing that burned clean, a flame needing a little to keep it alive, yet consuming everything he would give it. Hey, we'd love for you to join us on Patreon. If you're enjoying the show and want to help it grow, come check out our page and sign up. Members get access to bonus content like small groups, Bible studies, and a lot more. Also, we have a book on the Jesus Prayer over at Amazon. It's a great way to support the show and to walk deeper with Christ on your journey. So you can find all these links at freshgroundtheology.com. Welcome back to the Distracted Christian Podcast. I'm your host, Nate Labradorf, and this is a production of Fresh Ground Theology. What we just heard is a picture of love moving through desolation. One man on a dusty road, surrounded by people worn thin by a false king. And yet he keeps giving water, presence, a hand on a fevered brow, word across a fire. He doesn't have the sweetness that he once knew. He doesn't have even answers. But he has that quiet, stubborn pull to love anyway. And somehow, even in the ruin, that love keeps catching on to others. And that's exactly where St. John of the Cross is taking us next. Today, we're going deep into one of the most beautiful and challenging passages in all of Christian mystical literature. Chapters 10 and 11 of the second book of The Dark Night of the Soul, written by that 16th century Spanish mystic and poet, St. John of the Cross. If you've been following along, you know that John has been guiding us through what he calls the dark night, that painful, disorienting season of the spiritual life where God seems absent. Our old consolations have dried up, and we can't quite see where we're headed. It feels like loss, really. But John keeps insisting this is not abandonment, this is transformation. And in these two chapters, he finally shows us exactly what that means. Chapter 10 opens with one of the most arresting images in all mystical theology, a log of wood being transformed by fire. John wants us to sit with this image. I mean, really sit with it because it contains the entire logic of what God is doing in the dark night. Think about what happens when you place a damp, rough log into a fire. It doesn't immediately burst into flames or glow beautifully. First, it hisses. Steam rises as the moisture is driven out. The wood turns black, darkens, and it actually, in some ways, kind of looks worse than it did before. Uglier, smellier, more unsightly than before. And if you didn't know what fire does to wood, you might look at that black and smoking log and think something has gone terribly wrong. But of course, nothing has gone wrong. The fire is doing exactly what fire does. It is preparing the wood to become what the fire needs it to be. And eventually, if the fire keeps burning and the wood stays in the heat, something extraordinary happens. The wood begins to glow. It takes on the properties of the fire itself, giving warmth, giving light, radiating heat. And in John's words, the wood becomes as beautiful as the fire. This, John says, is precisely what God's contemplative love does to the human soul. Before God can unite the soul to himself in the deep transforming union that he intends, he must first purge it. And that purging, that burning away of everything contrary to the divine nature, is experienced by the soul as darkness, as affliction, as the feeling that everything good has been taken away. The soul turns black in a sense. It becomes aware of its own ugliness in ways that it never knew before. And here John makes the point that is so important, and we must not rush past it. He says that the soul is not actually worse than it was before. The evil, the imperfections, they're always there. They were simply hidden, deeply rooted, invisible in our own soul, but and hidden. The light of God's contemplative love is so bright that it illuminates what always has been lurking in the dark corners. The soul sees itself clearly, perhaps for the first time, and the sight is humbling, devastating, really. But the fire that reveals it is the same fire that purifies. And this is the breathtaking paradox that he's really wrestling with in the heart of this chapter. Now, out of this image, John draws out 7 lessons from this picture of fire and wood. And we're going to work through each one of these because each one is a gift to anyone walking through this period of spiritual darkness. First, he says, the same divine wisdom and love that wounds the soul is the same wisdom and love that will essentially unite with it. The fire that blackens is the fire that beautifies. God has not sent two different things. He has not sent a punishing force and a rescuing force. It is one love doing one work. Second, the suffering the soul feels in this season does not come from God's cruelty, but come from the soul's own incompleteness. The log doesn't suffer because the fire is malicious. It suffers because it contains moisture. It still has properties that resist the flame. As John puts it, without this purgation, the soul cannot simply receive the sweetness and light that God is offering. The capacity isn't there yet. The suffering is the expanding of that capacity to receive this fuller measure of God. Third, now John applies this, of course, he's a Catholic, so he applies this to souls in purgatory, which I do not believe exists as a third realm beyond after death. Um, and so I'm really going to move on through his third category into his fourth. So his fourth point is as the soul is purified, love grows stronger. The more the wood is prepared by fire, the hotter it will burn. The soul, even in darkness, is becoming more capable of love, not less. Fifth, the suffering intensifies over time because it is going deeper. The outer layers of imperfections burn away first, and the fire must reach into more interior, more subtle, more spiritual imperfections. These are the ones most deeply embedded. This is why, after periods of relief, the darkness often returns more piercing than before. This isn't a regression, it is the fire reaching inward. Six, there are grace intervals, moments of rest and even joy, when God seems to lift his hand from the work, as John puts it, like a craftsman stepping back to let us see what he has done before him. And those moments are real gifts. That soul should not be surprised, though, when it returns to the fire. Now, seventh and finally, John notes that even in these moments of joyful intervals, an attentive soul must perceive that a deeper root of imperfection still remains in him. And that perception is itself a kind of mercy, preparing the soul for what is still to come. Now, in chapter 11, um, the tone shifts a little bit. He's walked us through the logic of purification. Now, John turns to something warmer, more urgent, more ecstatic. He begins to describe what he calls enkindling love. It's a spiritual fire that arises in the soul, even in the midst of darkness. Now, this is crucial. The dark night is not merely a season of suffering, it is simultaneously a season of love, a love that is passive, infused, it's given. It's not generated by the soul's own effort or feelings. The soul doesn't manufacture this love. It simply opens to it, consents to it, is overwhelmed by it in a lot of ways. John is careful to distinguish this. the spiritual enkindling from a more surface level emotional warmth. This is something deeper, a wound at the level of the spirit itself. The soul feels God without quite seeing or understanding God. The intellect is still in darkness, but the will, the deep center of the person is being drawn and captured by his love. What does it feel like? Now, John doesn't romanticize it. He reaches for the image of a hungry dog running through the city at night, howling for what it wants it can't find. The soul loves God with almost an unbearable intensity, but does not yet possess what it loves. The thirst is real and the water is yet not in hand. He quotes the psalm, my soul thirsted for thee. In how many manners does my soul long for thee? And the suffering of Job lying awake through the night, counting the weary hours of mourning as he finds this picture. Everything becomes too small for the soul, John says. Heaven seems out of reach. Earth seems utterly insufficient. The soul is stretched between the two, longing, groaning, unable to rest anywhere. And here at the end of chapter 11, John offers one last quiet remark and observation here. In the midst of all this longing, the soul finds itself a companionship and a strength that something or someone is present in that darkness. The fire that wounds also holds, and when the intensity of the night momentarily lifts, the soul often feels more alone without it because it has grown accustomed to that fierce hidden presence. And that, dear friends, is the paradox of the dark night in the single sentence. The fire that seems most to destroy is the very fire in which we are most held. Now, I want to step back from what John is doing for a moment, not away from him, maybe behind him, and show you that what he is describing is not some kind of exotic invention of a medieval Spanish mystic. It is at its root deeply biblical. It has its fingerprints in the scriptures. And John himself knows this. I mean, he quotes all over John. He quotes Psalm 63, my soul thirsts for thee, and how many manners my soul longeth for thee. Even as that burning, aching longing is described, it's not a pathology. It is a recognizable pattern in the life of someone being drawn into God. So let's actually look at Psalm 63 and read it as a companion to the text that John has been talking about here. Because I think you'll find that David's wrestling with the same reality, the same fire, the same thirst, the same dark night, but in his own voice, his own idiom, his own raw human way. The psalm opens with one of the most direct, unguarded lines in all of scripture. "O God, you are my God, I seek you." Now, notice David does not say, I've found you. He does not say, I've rested in you. He says, I am seeking you. This is active, almost a desperate quality to this seeking. He says, my soul thirsts for you. My flesh faints for you, as in a dry and weary land where there is no water. The heading of the psalm in this tradition places it during David's flight into the wilderness during Absalom's rebellion. And David is driven from Jerusalem, from the sanctuary, from everything that has given him life. His religious and political life is just gone, and he is quite literally in the desert. And the external desert becomes a perfect image for his interior condition. And this is precisely the landscape that John is describing in The Dark Knight. The soul finds itself in a dry place. The old constellations are gone. Prayer feels empty. The spiritual senses that once were alive to God seem to have gone silent. John calls it darkness. David calls it a waterless desert. Different metaphors for sure, but the same existential territory. The felt absence of the one the soul most loves. And here is something worth sitting with. David doesn't conclude from this dryness that God is gone. He addresses God directly. He says, "Oh God, you are my God." The personal possessive hold that even in this desert is basically saying, "You are still mine. I am still yours, even though I cannot feel it." That is not a small thing. This is faith operating at the level below feeling. This is exactly what John says happens in the dark night. Verse 2, David says, "So I have looked upon you in the sanctuary, beholding your power and glory." The verb tense here is also important. David is not in the sanctuary now, he's in the wilderness. He's reaching back into his memory and he's saying, "I have seen you before. I know what you are like. And that memory sustains me here where I cannot see you." In the dark night, the soul often cannot perceive God's presence in that present moment, but it carries the memory of those previous encounters. Times of prayer that were alive, moments of grace that were unmistakable. Those memories are not nostalgia. They are evidence that they testify to God, to a God who is real then and therefore must be real now, even though it is silent. Verse 3 says, "Because your steadfast love is better than life, my lips will praise you." I mean, honestly, this is one of the most audacious lines in the whole Psalter. Like, better than life itself. David is saying that even his existence, his being alive, is not the highest good. God's chesed, his covenantal love, his loyal, tenacious, unbreakable love is worth more. If I have that, I have everything. If I lose everything else and retain that, I have not become ultimately lost. John says something similar to this when he argues that the soul, his dark night, is not being deprived of what matters most, is being stripped of what matters less so that it can receive what matters most. The dark night is not a subtraction, it is a brutal and loving reordering of values. Now, the night watch, verse 6, in the line that most directly ties to John's chapter 11 here. When I think of you in my bed and meditate on you in the watches of the night. In the ancient world, the night was divided into watches, periods of time marked through the long hours, and David is awake. He cannot sleep. And in that wakeful darkness, his mind turns to God. He is not describing peaceful evening devotions. He is describing a restless, aching meditation of someone who cannot stop thinking about the one he loves and yet cannot reach. This is the howling of John's dogs. This is Job counting the weary hours until the morning. The night watch is not comfortable, but David is there, present to God in the darkness, meditating, clinging. And something is happening in that clinging. By verses 7 and 8, the tone shifts. "For you have been my help, and in the shadow of your wings I sing for joy. My soul clings to you. Your right hand upholds me." Do you see that movement? Thirst, memory, praise, night watch, and then quietly, without fanfare, your right hand upholds me. He's not being rescued from the desert. He's not being transported back to the sanctuary. He's he's held being upheld in the very place of darkness. This is John's companionship and strength that the soul discovers in the midst of the dark fire. The intensity of the longing becomes, paradoxically, the place of the encounter. Verses 9 through 11 shift to a more martial register, if you would. David's enemies, the swords, jackals, this can feel like a jarring turn, but we shouldn't skip past it either. David is not suddenly becoming vindictive after all this praise to God. He's doing what Psalms do constantly. He is anchoring his trust in the character of God as a God of justice and covenant faithfulness. If God is real and good, then ultimately the wicked do not win, and the faithful are not abandoned. The king, David himself, shall rejoice in God. The future tense is an act of faith staked against the present suffering. John would call this the soul's consent to trust God's purposes even when he cannot see them. The dark night does something to a person. It does not suspend the faith in God's justice or goodness. It purifies that faith until it rests on something deeper than feeling or circumstance. It rests on God alone. Psalm 63 and John of the Cross, I'm not saying the exact same thing in every detail, of course not. But David is a warrior king writing poetry in the wilderness. John is this 16th century friar writing a systematic mystical theology in a Spanish monastery. Their worlds are really different, but they do share a single conviction that the thirst itself is not the enemy. The dryness is not evidence of God's absence. The night watch is not wasted time. The soul that clings in the dark says, your right hand upholds me. And this is the same soul that is far from edit. Edit. The soul that clings in the dark, the soul that says, your right hand upholds me before it can feel the hand in its own. That is, it is a soul on the far edge of something extraordinary. The fire knows what it's doing. God knows what he's doing. And the right hand does not let go. So, where does this lead us? Well, we always want to put a little concrete action to this. And honestly, it sounds very similar to things I've said before. But the truth is, we have to slow down and sit. And I'm going to give you three things about slowing down and listening to God this week. And, these aren't 5 steps or 3 steps to a perfect, peaceful life, but they are something that you can carry with you as you go through your week. First of all, name the season that you're in. If you're in a dry season right now, if prayer feels hollow, God feels distant, if the constellations that used to come easily have gone quiet, I want you to resist the immediate urge to fix it or panic about it. Instead, name it. Say it out loud, write it in a journal. I'm in a dry place. I'm thirsting. And based on what David and John of the Cross have said, this dryness is not meant that God is left. It means the fire is doing something I cannot see. Now, the act of naming it is not passive resignation. This is the act of faith, gives you clarity where you are. It is choosing to interpret your experience through the lens of scripture and the wisdom of the church, then rather than through the anxious voice that something has gone terribly wrong. Name where you are, hold it before God. And that is the beginning of this. Second step, return to what you have seen. David's move here in Psalm 63 was reaching back into his memory. I have looked upon you in the sanctuary, and I want you to do the same thing this week. Find a quiet moment, maybe tonight, maybe early tomorrow morning, and think back. Think about the time when God was unmistakably real to you. A moment of prayer that cracked open the heavens, a passage of scripture that felt like it was directly written to you, a season of life where you felt genuinely held by God. And write that down. Describe it in as much detail as you can remember. You're not chasing a feeling here. In a sense, you're kind of like building an altar, at least the way the Old Testament saints built altars. Here in this place, God showed up. And that memory that you have in your head is the evidence. And let it anchor you in the midst of present darkness in the way it anchored David in the wilderness. Third, stay in the night watch. Don't abandon your spiritual practices because they feel empty. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive thing I can say, but it is what both John and David model for us. David meditated on God in the watches of the night, not because it felt electric, but because he was a man who kept showing up. Keep praying, even when prayer feels like talking to a wall. Keep reading scripture, even when it seems flat. Keep showing up to worship even when you don't feel it. You are not performing for God, you are positioning yourself. Stay in the fire. Keep your hands open, trusting that that the work that God is doing in you is real work, even if you can't see it or feel it. The right hand that upholds you does not require that you feel it to be effective. Well, that's where we're going to end today. Thanks for spending this time with me on the Distracted Christian podcast, a production of Fresh Ground Theology. I know that you could have filled this hour with just about anything. So the fact that you chose to come and sit with me in St. John of the Cross I really appreciate it. Thank you. Huge thank to Anton Koryakov for the theme music. He is the one that makes me sound way calmer and wiser than I actually am. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcast, Amazon Music, or wherever you get your podcast, make sure that you follow or subscribe or whatever it is on that platform so you don't miss the next episode. And if this helped you even a little, leave a rating or share it with someone who's wondering why God feels quiet right now. For show notes, more reflections, other theological rabbit holes, and our flagship podcast, go over to freshgroundtheology.com. And that's where we park the extras. I'm Nate Labdorf. Thank you for listening. Stay faithful in the quiet, and I'll see you next time.